I'm very happy to introduce our guest this evening, Tabea Rude. She started her career at the Watchmaking School at Pforzheim, but I think a number of people here in the room first met her when she joined the clocks course at West Dean, after which she moved on to complete a master's degree with distinction in conservation with a focus on horology. And she then spent 18 months working at the Clockworks Museum in London. One project there involved the conservation of and the study of an important early clock by a former master of this company, William Hamilton Short. Tabea's article describing that clock and her work won her the 2017 Alan Shenton Award. Well, she then moved to Vienna to become the conservator at the Vienna Clock Museum, but then was elevated to the position of curator. And of course, that museum is at the centre of her lecture this evening. I was utterly delighted when she accepted my invitation to lecture us this evening. Tabea, there are a number of people here this evening who are extraordinarily proud of your achievements so early in your horological career. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the platform Tabea Rude.
Master, distinguished guests, fellow horologists, many thanks for the introduction and for the kind invitation to speak at this event. There are lots of museums in the world with clocks and watches in them, but there are not many dedicated clock museums. The Clockmakers Company probably has the oldest collection focused solely on clocks and watches and is just over 200 years old. Like so many collections and museums, there was a small group of visionary people whose influence on the founding of the museum and its early years was enormous. I look after another such clock museum, which is just over 100 years old and shown here on the left. The Vienna Clock Museum. And like the Clockmakers Company, there were visionary people pushing for it. A single collection of clocks and watches formed its nucleus. The man who built that collection, Rudolf Kaftan, was a fascinating and complex person. And I intend to tell the story of the museum by examining some facets of his life. He was born in 1870. The year of the Franco-Prussian War. He died 91 years later in 1961, 16 years after the end of the second of two devastating wars, each of which was highly significant for the museum. Rudolf Kaftan was born to Anna and Josef Kaftan on 13th of April 1870 in the town of Haslach, a place in Upper Austria close to today's Czech and German borders, marked here with a yellow circle. This map also shows Vienna highlighted in a black square and reminds us of how large and culturally diverse the Austro-Hungarian Empire was. Haslach was centered on the textile industry, and the von Willer factory was its main employer, dominating local trade. Anna's family was an integral part of the community, employed at the factory and involved in all manner of Catholic church events and musical get-togethers. Rudolf's father, Josef, probably immigrated from the modern Czech Republic, working as a teacher in various places in Upper Austria before he met Anna. Rudolf was joined by a younger brother, and after a short period living in Haslach, the family moved on, as Josef was appointed to another small village as a teacher. 2 children and 3 villages later, the family finally settled in St. Johann am Wimberg in 1879, where Josef was made head teacher until his retirement 23 years later. The family probably lived in the school building, as was customary at that time. According to Rudolf, clocks entered his life at a very early stage. He He wrote, "My mother, whose parents had immigrated from Reichenwald in northern Bohemia, once spoke to a woman about an old clock which was in our attic. I was then 4 or 5 years old. I found this old clock. It was a Black Forest clock with wooden wheels and glass bells. I was really excited. I wanted it, but of course I didn't get it. At the age of 7, this first hottest love was finally mine. From then on, I was forever addicted to the mechanical. Being mechanical was in my blood, from my mother's father, and my mother was also very talented in mechanical engineering." Rudolf spent his free time picking up pins at the local bowling alley to earn money, and with other little jobs around the village. With this money, he finally went out and bought his first clock all on his own. Rudolf spent, fearful and blissful, I dragged it home and had to pay for this first great happiness with a beating. Rudolf celebrated his first big triumph as a clock repairer at the age of 12 at his school, the Diocesan Seminary for Boys in Freienberg. Between school lessons, he fixed the clock in one of the monastery's hallways and received 2 apples in return. In the school holidays, he roamed the area and repaired clocks for local farmers and made himself a name as Uhrenrudi. Kaftan later recalled that at the time he already had a good collection of clocks and intended to invent a perpetual motion machine. His father wasn't fond of Rudolf's hobby. He pointed out that for a family of his standing, he was supposed to study and not spend his time doing manual labor. So Rudolf continued down the path his parents had chosen for him, while working on clocks in his free time. The Diocesan Seminary, which you see here on the left, was specifically for preparation to become a priest or a novice in a monastery. Rudolf and his brother Erwin were then sent to the Linz Diocesan Theological Institute, shown on the right, to continue on this path. This was not unusual in the very Catholic region of Upper Austria. Many families wished their children to become priests. However, Kaftan left before receiving a degree 2 years later in 1894. He moved to Vienna and enrolled at Vienna University in the autumn of 1894, reading for a teacher's degree in maths and physics. Probably because until now he had lived and studied in relatively small groups, he struggled in the much larger city of Vienna. He later wrote, "When I was studying in Vienna, I was completely dependent on myself. I felt bad then. As a tutor, I made my way through. There was no buying of clocks during these difficult times." As the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Vienna was a bustling transport hub. On the left, we have a view onto Naschmarkt, the most famous marketplace in Vienna, where goods have been sold since the 16th century. And on the right, St. Stephan's Cathedral at the center of Vienna. In 1899, after 10 semesters, Kaftan signed up for his exams, which according to his transcripts never took place, owing to a missed appointment, which means he never completed his degree. He was able to work as a teaching assistant, though, which he did in the years to come. During his early years as an assistant teacher, working at about 4 different grammar schools, he developed a school bell timer and filed a patent for it in 1903. He installed it in at least 2 schools, and one of those installations remained in place until 1931 and is now part of our collection. It's shown here in the center and on the right. The subject of the patent was not the clock itself, which was a normal weight-driven wall-mounted seconds pendulum clock. However, it was additionally equipped with a contact disc. This wooden contact disc rotated once every 4 hours and had contacts in the form of copper wires. On one side of the disc, contacts were set at the usual break times, which closed an electric circuit and set off a bell, as shown in figure 1. On the other side, the contact disc was equipped with contacts that closed the circuit and triggered the bell on the hour, as seen here in figure 2. Unfortunately, none of the surviving clocks using the system is complete with its contact disc as in the patent. However, the case of an impulse clock, including the dial, has survived. Through the dial, the 4-hour rotation of the contact disc can be understood. How exactly the interaction between the rotating contact disc and the fixed contact operated is unfortunately not clear from the patent. It seemed to have worked sufficiently well enough, though, as Kaftan won a silver medal at the 1906 International Hygiene Exhibition. Sometime during these early years as a teacher and inventor of school bell ringing systems, he must have met his future patron and dear friend Heinrich Obersteiner, since a registration form records that he moved in at the Obersteiner residence in Döbling near Vienna in December 1905, probably as an in-house teacher to Obersteiner's 2 children. Professor Dr. Heinrich Obersteiner was an internationally renowned neurologist and psychiatrist, founder and director of the private Neurological Institute in Vienna, and professor of physiology and pathology at Vienna University. His residence, where Kaftan lived from 1905, was also home to the first private sanatorium for the mentally and neurologically ill. Obersteiner took over this leading role at the private asylum from his father, marrying Helene, the daughter of his father's colleague, Dr. Max von Leidesdorf. Kaftan and Obersteiner shared one major passion: collecting. Obersteiner accumulated prepared body parts, an extensive medical library, porcelain, and a collection of folk songs. One of Obersteiner's colleagues for 45 years, Dr. Julius Krück, was also an avid collector. Krück collected a number of odd artifacts, including animal brains, buttons, postal fiscal stamps, coins, newspapers from around the world, and the most surprising of all, wait for it, sausages. He developed a technique to preserve a thin sliver of every kind of sausage between 2 glass plates, similar to a microscopic sample, accumulating 150 examples. If being surrounded by others obsessed by collecting was any advantage, Kaftan enjoyed the best possible company to foster his enthusiasm and to shape and hone his collecting ambitions. All 3 men appeared to be completist collectors, set collectors if you like, interested in finding every variety available to complete their specific set of collections. Kaftan was less focused on any particular type of clock or watch. He clearly did not mind size or degree of decay. His collection could not be stored neatly in a box like a set of specimen sausage slides probably could, but advancing his collection meant finding every possible technical variant ever made in horology. The outer shell, the case of the clock or watch, was secondary. We can see his cramped living conditions here. Sleeping and living accommodation came a distinct second. He commented, "Only when I was a real assistant teacher of mathematics and physics was I able to think about increasing my much-loved collection. Now I started collecting the big clocks." Kaftan gave private lessons to increase his income. He gave up evening meals in order to save money. His stomach may have complained, but Kaftan brought home clocks and watches. A later account summed it up as follows: "He went to gather watches as hunters go hunting, wooed to the prey that awakened his collecting rage. It had fallen to the hunter. With cunning, guile, and tenacity, he brought it into his possession." During his time living in his attic, he accumulated nearly 10,000 objects. A lot of movements or incomplete clocks and watches made between the 15th century to the early 20th century. He also built a horological library. In these two images, we see that despite the mess, there's some kind of order. Wooden clocks on the left all around his bed, and on the right, iron wall clocks and some turret clocks in the foreground. Heinrich Obersteiner's affairs took an unfortunate turn, as he lost most of his possessions during the First World War. He, his family, and Kaftan had to evacuate the premises, as the family sold the sanatorium, which was then demolished sometime between 1916 and 17. But Kaftan and Obersteiner stayed very much in touch, and indeed, Obersteiner was also very much involved in the foundation of the Clock Museum. Kaftan's collection first received attention in wider circles after his lecture at the Scientific Society in Vienna in 1911, followed by reports about the lecture in horological and collectors' journals. Kaftan was now receiving visitors to his attic chamber on a regular basis. In 1916, after the death of the famous Austrian poet Marie von Ebner-Eschenbach, her pocket watch collection was temporarily exhibited at the Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna, where Kaftan happened to meet the reporter Helene Tuschak-Lafitte. He invited her to his clock chamber in the Obersteiner Villa, telling her about the upcoming demolition and his need for a new home. Helene was an important, influential columnist. Following her visit, she wrote an article entitled "The Homeless Collector," describing Kaftan's situation and his collection. This made an impression on the right people. Several more reports followed, and the formation of a commission to examine and appraise the collection as a potential purchase for the city of Vienna took place much faster than usual. At the same time, Kaftan also offered his collection to the city of Budapest and the Technical Museum in Vienna. Time became pressing, as he had to evacuate the premises. Budapest offered an old Piarist monastery as a new site, and the Technical Museum wanted the collection very much, but had no money for the collector. It becomes clear that Kaftan did not actually want to part with his collection. He wasn't interested in money, but more in a place where he could exist together with his collection. And naturally, Vienna was his first choice, as it was home and he did not speak Hungarian. But he did enjoy teaching and talking about his collection. So making him and the collection part of a museum made sense. Kaftan's collection was appraised by both local experts and prominent Nuremberg collector Gustav Speckert, who was invited to view it. Richard Weiskirchner, the mayor of Vienna, and Emil Panosch, the chairman of the Clock and Watchmakers Cooperative and local councillor, pushed the matter forward. On May the 4th, 1917, at Panosch's formal request, the city council decided to purchase the collection of 10,000 objects and incorporate it into a separate department of the city collection. Panosch remarked that the special value of the collection was that it was able to demonstrate virtually the whole technical development of the mechanical clock. However, there were voices ranged against the investment right in the middle of the First World War, observing that its scope was too niche and it did not interest the wider public. They argued it was only of interest for specialists in the nearly extinct clock and watchmaker's craft. But it was nevertheless decided. Rudolf Kaftan was offered the role as custodian to live and work with his collection in the building known as Schulhof 2 in downtown Vienna. The Vienna Fire Department transported Kaftan's collection in 17 loads from the Obersteiner Villa to his new home in the city center. This oddly shaped building had been a thorn in the city side for a long time, as it was usually seen as a traffic obstruction. However, shortly before Kaftan moved in, and also during the early days of the museum, it had a surprisingly large number of both users and residents. Most of these neighbors stayed, and Kaftan, together with his clocks, moved into the third floor of the building. Nearly immediately, he put his talents to good use, extending the collection, being persistent, even ruthless. For example, he succeeded in acquiring the Ebner-Eschenbach collection we saw on the previous slide. This was much to the dismay of the competition, which included far more established and experienced museum professionals, such as the Museum of Applied Arts and also the Technical Museum, which had already commissioned a custom-made, fully glazed display case in anticipation. When Kaftan collected the iron chest from the Technical Museum containing the precious pocket watch collection, the Technical Museum director is said to have shouted after him, "Thief!" The handing over of the keys to the chest apparently took longer than necessary. But at the end of the day, the Technical Museum actually gifted the specially made glass display case to the Clock Museum. Gathering funds to buy this collection of 270 pocket watches had not been easy. The Friends of the Museum Trust was founded and payment had to be postponed many times. The collection contained Nuremberg and Augsburg pocket watches from the 16th century and Swiss enamel watches in various unusual shapes from the 18th and 19th centuries. The collection cost a third more than Kaftan's whole collection of 10,000 objects. The Friends of the Museum Trust did not rest on its laurels. A collection of 110 bracket clocks was purchased from the estate of the late Gustav Leiner, a businessman trading in oils and fabrics. Soon after, Kaftan made a strange request. He wanted a collection of 450 pocket watches owned by the chronometer maker Josef Nikolaus to be paid for by a delivery of 30 metric tons of coal. Nikolaus was forced to sell his collection in order to keep warm in the unusually cold winter of 1917 and 1918. The most important purchases were made in the first 3 years of the museum, and with the establishment of the Friends of the Museum Trust, the network of donors, patrons, and visitors rapidly developed. Times were difficult in Vienna. So it is not surprising that the newly founded museum had teething problems. The opening, planned for 1919, had to be postponed because materials were scarce and the museum could not be decked out with the necessary furniture. The demise of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy led to significant supply shortages, not only of building materials, but especially of food and coal for heating and electricity. Crime, homelessness, hunger, and poverty were rife in the mostly unlit streets, and the city certainly had far more pressing problems than fitting out a museum. But even without furniture, Kaftan did his best to create some sort of order in the few rooms available to him. This first arrangement of clocks, shown here, gives us an insight into what Kaftan was hoping for to achieve in his new role as a museum professional. Arranging the rooms strictly by escapement and chronologically, regardless of countries of origin, size, or type of case, gives the visitor the opportunity to understand and follow the evolution and gradual development of clocks comprising trains of wheels. While we see many clocks with dials on them in these photos, horologists remarked, "What makes it so valuable for the specialist, contrary to other clock and watch collections, where beautiful cases are the main thing, is that here the movements can be seen freely. It pleases the specialist the most that one can observe each movement well, because Mr. Kaftan has removed all the dials." He also stored dials separately from their movements, which still presents difficulties today in trying to find the right dial for the right clock. The larger purchases made in the first few years were not so much for technical reasons, but to increase diversity and to add pieces of noteworthy appearance. The first 3 major acquisitions, the collections from Ebner-Eschenbach, Leiner, and Nikolaus, added a lot in terms of representing the history of clock and watch design. as well as other crafts, such as that of the enamelers, goldsmiths, silversmiths, casemakers, and engravers, all revealing the tastes and styles of eras past. If this development was encouraged or pushed for by the friends of the Museum Trust or by political parties is unclear, but the Trust certainly helped by agitating for more space. In 1921, the museum was expanded to the second floor, which is why the official opening was pushed back to the 31st of May that year. Furniture was now installed, and the specific rooms intended to demonstrate each step in horological development crystallized further. Although the museum was now open to the public, visitors still had to make an appointment and were shown around in groups of no more than 12 people, as the rooms were too crowded with objects to allow individual visitors. 8 years later, in 1929, Kaftan's constant nagging about cramped space finally paid off, and the city of Vienna released the museum's first floor for exhibition use. The early 1930s continued just as briskly, followed by an expansion of the exhibition in form of a turret clock room, affectionately called the torture chamber by Kaftan. Even though the museum was founded much later than the Clockmakers Company collection, it still shared some of the same ideas. It was very much set up for promoting and supporting horology and horologists. It was at the heart of the local network of the industry, with close ties to the trade and the Clock and Watchmakers Cooperative and the Viennese Clock and Watchmakers Guild. The Clock Museum agreed with the Guild's Board of Education that it would provide a training workshop to give trainee horologists the opportunity to study and do odd bits of repair work in the museum. The library and archives in the largest room of the house were open to the public regularly and free of charge for the watchmakers and clockmakers. In January 1921, Kaftan published an open call to the clock and watchmaking community, outlining his plan to establish a photographic album to record master watch and clockmakers, asking them to submit photos and information about themselves for posterity. The building was not just focused on the past. At least as important was the view to the future and support for future makers and technicians, echoing the ethos of science museums around the world. Championing the cause of science was a serious issue for Kaftan. From its earliest days, the museum was equipped with the latest available time standard, a precision pendulum clock situated next to the main entrance with a high-tech quartz glass pendulum rod. This was not just advertising for the inventor and the museum, it was also a place where the correct time could be consulted. This was especially useful because before 1924, as the public clocks in Vienna were in a desperate state, with investments in the 1920s, the situation improved. But a fully functioning network of distributed synchronized time was only realized after the Second World War. In 1925, Kaftan started getting involved in radio broadcasts for the first Austrian radio company, Ravak. 3 evenings each week, from 6:30 to 8 p.m., he presented the Clock Museum, as if on a guided tour. As the magazine Radio Wien reported, Kaftan's radio program was popular because not only did he talk, but he also had an exciting soundscape. They heard clocks ticking, gongs roaring, cuckoos singing, organs sounding, and little levers activating. A program for both young and old. As a result, the radio was a frequent guest at the Clock Museum. In 1930, it formed part of the program The Wandering Microphone, and then in 1933 it was on show for young listeners as part of a school program. It featured on quite a few other occasions in shorter broadcasts. In an administrative report in 1926, Kaftan noted the growing interest in the museum. He recorded that he had welcomed students from 23 educational institutions such as watchmakers, mechanics, engravers, and workers' groups. He had given 321 free guided tours to a total of 4,095 visitors in that year. And each one of those visits took an average of 2 hours. Besides horology, there's another fascinating aspect to Kaftan's life. He was also deeply involved in the Esperanto movement, designed to provide a universal second language, invented by the Jewish ophthalmologist Ludwig Leitzer-Zamenhof in 1887. Esperanto enjoyed significant and increasing popularity just before the Second World War. It was taught at many schools, as well as in other institutions, including employees of the city of Vienna and the state railways. Kaftan actively participated in meetings from about 1911 and was a founding member of the Esperanto Societo Danubio and the Austrian Esperanto Federation. The first time we see any mention of his future wife, Else Marie Eitenbichler, was on the occasion of Kaftan's visit to the 8th International World Esperanto Congress in Krakow in 1912. They married in 1919, once Kaftan had settled in the museum. Their marriage was described as very harmonious. Else shared Kaftan's delight in strange wonders, and amongst other things, she also said to have helped Kaftan to assemble turret clocks. Besides his involvement as founding member, president and host of Esperanto meetings, Kaftan set up a private Esperanto school called Antauen, which he operated from the Obersteiner residence. Furthermore, he was a member of several other subgroups. One of these was the Universal Business Transit Service Association for Foreign Economic Affairs, a group that intended to establish Esperanto as a universal language in all 6 countries along the Danube. 10 different languages were spoken along this busy trade route, and one can readily understand there might be an economic advantage in improving understanding between all regional partners. The Esperanto movement offers echoes of the desire for time reform among all the different local time zones, but the Esperanto community was not just interested in practicalities. Rationalization and standardization of language. Esperanto was also very much a peace movement, a striving towards global networks of communications, and this explains why it was outlawed by the Nazis and Esperantists who were persecuted during their regime. With the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany from March 1938, all Jewish households, including the approximately 650 clock, watch, and jewelry businesses owned by Jewish inhabitants, were robbed of their assets and homes. Businesses were systematically inventoried by so-called Aryanization offices. Once inventoried, it was then decided if a business should be either liquidated and its stock sold off by state organizations, or if businesses should be Aryanized, which meant being taken over by non-Jewish members of the profession. Of the 650 businesses in watch, clock, and jewelry trade, approximately 540 were liquidated. Kaftan, though he was never actively part of any political party, knowingly acquired objects looted and robbed from his Jewish colleagues. With the Aryanization office right next to the museum, he was one of the first people to know when businesses were liquidated. He visited at least one of the businesses personally between 1938 and 1939 to take home objects for which the museum paid very much under their market value. The museum stayed open for visitors until 1943, at which point the government decided that the collection should be moved out of the city. Kaftan fought tooth and nail against the evacuation of the museum, but was forced at the age of 74 to pack up the majority of the collection in approximately 200 crates, which were then transported to castles in Lower Austria in December 1943. Up to that date, he had welcomed a total of around 56,000 visitors and guided 5,000 tours through the museum. Officially, the Clock Museum was closed from January 25, 1944. From then on, Else and Rudolf spent most of their time in their small holiday home called Else Hütte in Nussdorf. And I only rarely went to Vienna for short visits. The holiday home, described as a neat summer cottage, was not a place designed for long cold winters. Kaftan reported on cold weeks, bread shortages, and rising electricity and coal bills. But overall, the couple remained relatively safe from bombings. In 1945, Kaftan's entries in the Chronicle of the Clock Museum describe how they were cut off from Vienna by the suspension of trains and the temporary cessation of mail. Then more refugees from Vienna arrived in Nussdorf. On the 6th of May 1945, the Americans liberated Nussdorf from the Nazi regime. But it was only in November that year that a visit to Vienna became possible. It was not until March 1946 that Rudolf and Else were finally able to return permanently to Vienna. The return of the collection was, as one might expect, not the smoothest of affairs. Witness a call for help in the newspaper Weltpresse, which Kaftan published with the support of the director of the city collections, asking the population to report anything suspicious, since it now transpired that the most valuable parts of the collection were missing from the boxes and crates that had been returned to the Clock Museum. The museum building itself had suffered damage to the roof and thus to the third floor. Now we start again, he is said to have called out when he re-entered the building after such a long absence. Together with Else, he began the reconstruction. The renovation work was tiring and difficult for a couple in their 70s and took a long time. The museum finally reopened officially in June 1948. Looking back on his work for the Vienna Clock Museum, Kaftan commented, "I have now passed the time of my childhood with clocks and watches, and after 60 years of practical work, I can say that it had been worth my while. The Clock Museum has become my dearest and most precious child because it taught me to understand time and the Viennese." In 1955, on the occasion of his 85th birthday, Rudolf Kaftan was awarded the Medal of Honor of the city of Vienna by the mayor. We are now looking at a small horizontal table clock with a dog automaton whose eyes move in time with the pendulum, made around 1610 in Augsburg. It is one of our most popular objects with our school groups and so far never represented anything but the unison of different crafts in one object. It is the creative expression of several metal workers in one jolly little animal. Last year, the context of this object radically shifted. I found the documentation that revealed this clock was sold through one of the sales outlets of the Arianization offices in Vienna, which means the object was stolen from its former Jewish owner. Suddenly, this cute showstopper lost its innocence and began telling a whole other story. A restitution process has been set in motion, and the object will leave the Clock Museum and it will be moved into the exhibition spaces dedicated to the restitution process operated by the Vienna City Main Museum, which will open late in 2023. We do not know who it belonged to, as it went through several hands before it ended up in the Clock Museum. There's some hope that through publishing its history and exhibiting it in that context, we will be able to find out more and eventually find its rightful owners. You will be aware that many museums in the UK are dealing with colonially looted and stolen objects. Museums in Germany and Austria have been trying for a long time to find the rightful owners of objects stolen during the Nazi regime. The Vienna Clock Museum, which is part of the Vienna City Museums Group, I am very lucky to have a colleague who is appointed by the museum to deal with this process, the restitution of objects. A process which is still ongoing and will be for many years to come. Through collaboration with my colleague Gerhard Milcham, I have learned a lot about how objects with questionable backgrounds can be identified, but I learned most about the museum's history itself and its founding director, who cared for the museum and lived in the rooms at the top of the building from 1917 to 1961. It was the research work associated with the restitution work which led me so deep into the life of Rudolf Kaftan and which taught me how museum histories and object histories can be told over and over again in completely different contexts. I hope I was able to draw a picture for you of some of the many facets of the Vienna Clock Museum and how it has changed over time. Although in Vienna I face very different challenges from those faced by my friends here in the Clockmakers Museum, I have found it vital to be in touch and to collaborate with other horologists and other specialists in adjacent fields, to ask for advice and to learn from them. Only through this teamwork are we able to uncover some of the stories that remain hidden from view. The small group of visionary people who established collections, such as those of the Clockmakers Museum or the Vienna Clock Museum, are only the beginning in each case. They leave us with a legacy that needs to be carried forward, nurtured, sometimes transformed, but which also demands continued critical evaluation. We need to explore new and different viewpoints to make sure our collections are still telling us relevant stories. We need to continue looking at our collections in every available light, to see what they can reveal to us, whether about the past, the present, or even sometimes the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tabea, for that extraordinary journey through the life of your museum. If I can be flippant first and be serious second, I think there might in the room have been a little quickening of the hearts of some, the words completist collector and visions of rooms filled with clocks. Yes, you know who you are. What a wonderful line you had. He invited her to his clock chamber. That's going to live with me for a while. Thank you for taking us on a journey through the remarkable life of your museum and, of course, the life of an extraordinary man who was at the heart of it. That museum emerged during a really extraordinary period of human history, quite clearly. And as the latter part of your lecture revealed, there are some extraordinary challenges that flow from that. So that was sobering. Now, this is not like one of the AHS lectures that some of you come to, so we're not going to field lots of questions from the floor. If those of you are not, some of you might not be in direct contact with Tabea already, I will always facilitate that if you want to ask questions or be in touch with her. What I would simply like to do on behalf of all of us is to offer a very small gift in appreciation of your kind agreement in travelling to be with us this evening and for offering us such a fascinating lecture. Tabea, thank you so very much. Thank you.